Call to order tonight of the January 8th, 2024 edition of the Town of Garner Planning Commission. Happy that you all are here. Microphone sounds a little louder today. Can we go ahead and please do the roll call?
Good evening, Commissioners. I will call the roll. Gina Avent. Here. John Blasco.
Here.
Ralph Carson. Here. Philip Jefferson. Here. Jehan Hodges. Here. Sherry Phillips. Here. And Michael Voiland. Here. 7 members present.
All right, thank you. I believe Mr. Voiland has offered to do the invocation, statement
Yes.
of...
No need to bow your heads. This is just some thoughts. Expanded development occurring in suburban and rural areas can frequently be viewed by residents as a negative thing. They tend to fear a loss of open natural areas, increasing traffic congestion, and chaos that might come from the faster pace of life as more people live closer together. But it's important to see that if well planned with forethought, further development can have positive outcomes that residents can benefit from. These include careful inventorying and stewardship of natural environments, less unregulated sprawl, the placement of open spaces and buildings that are closer to the people, greater interest in public transportation modes, and closer proximity to healthcare. Moreover, there can be greater opportunities for people of diverse backgrounds and walks of life to meet, to mingle, to share experiences, and to create greater social connections, engagement events, and neighborhood mini-cultures, so to speak. And lastly, there are positive results that can happen within mixed-use spaces where residing, working, playing, and the exchange of goods and services, all happening together in a location, can create desirable patterns to daily living. So let's try to remember that to some people living in a fast-growth area like Garner, land development changes can be hard to fathom and even quite scary. Our duty as advisors and reviewers of proposed land use changes is always to keep that in mind. But we also have a duty to always try and envision and then advocate for how those proposed changes must lead to a better community in the future.
All right, thank you, Mr. Voiland. As always, well said. All right, moving on. Do we have a motion to adopt the agenda?
I'll make the motion.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. Do you want to do a roll call?
Sure. Gina Avent. Aye. John Blasco.
Aye.
Ralph Carson.
Aye.
Philip Jefferson.
Aye.
Jehan Hodges. Aye. Sherry Phillips. Aye. And Michael Voiland.
Aye.
And that's unanimous.
Thank you. Do we have a motion regarding the minutes?
I'll make a motion that the minutes be accepted as written.
I'll second that.
Prior to doing a roll call, since I was absent at the last meeting, I'll abstain from this vote.
Okay. Gina Avent. Aye. Ralph Carson.
Aye.
Philip Jefferson.
Aye.
Jehan Hodges.
Aye.
Sherry Phillips. Aye. And Michael Voiland.
Aye.
And that's unanimous.
All right, thank you very much. Before we get into our old and new business, our newly elected mayor has asked to speak to the commission for a moment. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. And he told me that I would have to state my name and address. Buddy Gupton, 153 Luxor Wind Drive. Thank you for letting me be here and speak tonight. I wanted to just say a big thanks to all of the people on the Planning Commission. Sometimes it's a thankless job. As Mr. Voiland pointed out, people are afraid of change. They're scared of change. It's always intimidating. But change can be good if it's done correctly, and your job is to help us do it correctly. I can't thank you enough for the time that each of you takes to be here. Sometimes it's a thankless task. You could be home with your family, but thank you for being here and doing the hard stuff. I also want to give you words of encouragement. To be yourself, look in your heart. You've had lots of training, lots of experience to make good decisions. I want to make sure that we continue to give you good guidelines, good things, good training so you can make good decisions. Now, I was in Boy Scouts here in Garner long ago, and I remember the first 8 words of the pledge, and I think that's enough. On my honor, I will do my best. Okay, what else can you say? Just do your best, and we appreciate that. And I would ask you also, and I've even heard Ralph say this, to ask yourself, is this the best we can do on any particular project, any particular question, any particular project that you're doing yourself, performance that you're doing, is this the best I can do? If it's the best you can do, if you're doing your best, you're doing great. And all the citizens appreciate you, and you appreciate the citizens who come and have some input too. So thank you very much, and help us get better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. All right, excuse me. Moving on to the next item on the agenda is CZPD 2204, the park at Garner Station. I'll go ahead and make a motion that we continue this to the next meeting, or to a meeting to be named later, until the next meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
Call the vote. Gina Avent. Aye. John Blasco.
Aye.
Ralph Carson.
Aye.
Philip Jefferson.
Aye.
Jehan Hodges. Aye. Sherry Phillips. And Michael Voiland.
Aye.
And that's unanimous.
All right, thank you much. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, zoning text amendment ZTA 2304, technical corrections.
All right, you get me tonight. Well, good evening, Planning Commission members. I hope you had a good holiday. Well, I guess y'all didn't really get a break from this. But hope you had good holidays. And we are back with some text amendments. We have this one here tonight and another one that we are working on teeing up as well. But this one is probably the simpler of the ones that we have in the pipeline. This one is primarily just aimed at correcting some technical errors when the new UDO was first adopted. We as staff have been working with it now for a little while, although I will say we're just really now starting to get projects that are completely under the new ordinance. We've had a lot of them that were still subject to previous versions of the UDO. So it has taken us a bit to really start to work with the new document. But as with anything, you never catch all the little errors here and there. So a lot of those, and then a few that have just come up with needing some clarification as to where things were headed. So I will go through these with you here tonight. I don't plan on spending a whole lot of time unless you have questions. What you will notice with the coloring in your staff report, the items in green are things that were updated since we took this to the town council at public hearing. So this has been reviewed by them twice, once at their work session to introduce it, and then once at public hearing. And so now it's coming to you.
Jeff, before we get too far down the road, I guess I would encourage commission members to make comments as we go.
Yep.
As opposed to saving your comments till the end, that way, because there's a few to get through, so just
Yes.
as we go through, please speak up.
Yes. Okay, so the first one, and this is one that requires probably a little more explanation. If you scroll down to the use table in section 6.1, you'll see here a little green box where it says single-family detached in the MFA district. Originally, when this was first brought to the council, we had proposed adding single-family detached residential as a special use permit in the MFA district. Reason being is that under the old UDO, the old MF1 district, which was transferred to MFA under the new ordinance, had a provision where, as part of a clustered development, so smaller lots, bigger buffers, you could propose single-family detached housing. So if you're familiar with the village at Aversboro, that is a clustered single-family detached subdivision, and it was zoned MF1 and is now zoned MFA. Others, more recently, that you may recall include Gatsby Station. That was a mix of townhomes and single-family detached. That was also zoned MFA, and they did their single-family under the clustering provisions. Another one was trying to think of all the ones. McCullers Walk was another. So down there behind the Food Lion, we had the apartments, the townhomes, and the single family. Again, all proposed together, but the single family was done as a clustered residential piece within the MF1, now MFA district. So all in all, we have 5 of these neighborhoods. And the concern was, when we adopted the new zoning, was not to make things non-conforming. And a non-conforming use is probably the one non-conformity you really want to be aware of. And we just did not catch that when we did this new ordinance that we took single-family detached out of the MFA, because the MFA zone does encompass now both what used to be the MF1 and the MF2. And so when we were writing this ordinance, we really wanted our multifamily districts to focus on multifamily types of housing. And so we just kind of missed that there was that nuance to the MF1 under the old ordinance that did allow for a type of single-family detached. If that use is now a non-conforming use, folks would not be able to expand their house. So if they wanted to add on, you can't make a non-conformity worse than it already is. They could keep maintaining their home and it could continue to be single family, but if you wanted to do any kind of improvements that would expand the floor area, you'd be out of luck. So there was discussion again at the council about whether we wanted to reintroduce single-family detached into a multifamily zone. Prevailing opinion was that we probably don't want to do that if we can accomplish making these existing neighborhoods not have to deal with that nonconformity status. So there's a couple ways we could go about it. One would be to rezone those 5 neighborhoods to, say, the new R8 district. But that's, a fairly cumbersome process. Everybody has to be notified. A lot of probably explanation that we would have to do to tell them why we're doing this and to get all that understood. So after talking with the town attorney, what we kind of came to settle on for you all to consider tonight is that we just write an exception into that non-conforming uses section and just acknowledge that if you are single-family detached in an MFA or MFB district, something that transferred from the old ordinance, that you are exempt from that section and the non-conformities clause does not apply to you. We'll still have setbacks from those districts that we can still apply to those properties going forward. It just won't be something that a new proposal would be able to do. So does that make sense?
Just a question on that. So is that just going to be the exception is noted, or is that going to be permitted by right, or is that going to be a special use, or does that even get categorized?
It ends up not even getting categorized as that. It'll just be a by right according to the setbacks standards of that district. Okay. If you do think of anything else, don't feel afraid to interrupt me. Just say, hey, I want to go back to that. Then we had just a couple of clarifications with 160D. So membership in terms of the Planning Commission. Again, just a reminder that ETJ, that for the way we've structured our commission, if you're an ETJ member, which would be Miss Gina and Jahan, that you are entitled to vote on all projects regardless. Some commissions have it set up that in-town people are the only ones who vote on in-town projects. But we've never operated that way, so we just wanted to be clear about that. Same with the Board of Adjustment. So I think those two are fairly straightforward. Then we have section 4.3, the review authority table. This one is mostly just correcting some typos, as well as though for text amendments, this was an oversight. With text amendments, there's not one small area that is subject to the change. So for a rezoning, we notify all the folks within, that 800 feet of the rezoning proposal. A text amendment applies jurisdiction-wide. And so there was never an intent to mail everybody in Garner a first-class notice for text amendments. We still do publish them online, so if folks are subscribed and they still follow the same process, they go to a work session, they go to council, they come to you. So there should be plenty of opportunity for folks to be aware of these things, but to have a geographic component to it, which is why you see B and C dropped out. Text amendments usually are only just notified on the website or in the newspaper in days past.
One question on that. If residents have signed up for notifications, that still applies? They'll still get automatically notified without having to go to the website?
Right, yes, we'll still push those out via the e-notification. So if folks have subscribed to that, they'll get those notices, yeah. And speaking of public notice, again, just a few text clarifications with that. Again, the general location, again, not applicable to text amendments because there is no general location, it's jurisdiction-wide. Parcel number and street address, again, clarifying that that's not applicable to text amendments. A description or a summary of the action that's requested. Identity of the applicant, so knowing who it is. And again, the purpose here was just to try to unify these things as much as possible across the different types of applications that we have. So again, in consulting with the town attorney, these were the agreed upon changes to that. And then under the mailed notice, again, being clear that the applicable contents of that published notice, along with the map, making sure that that's consistent with what's required online. So previously it wasn't, there wasn't a direct correlation between the published notice and the mailed notice, and we wanted to be sure that all of the same information that's in one type of notice, the one that's published, is the same information that goes in the letter. That is a general requirement, but that was not clear the way things were structured before. Harry, did I capture all of that? Well, okay, thank you.
In item number 6, that change, is that just to eliminate people just contacting the applicant directly, and you want them to funnel kind of through the process?
That's typically how most places do it. It's still public information. If folks really want to, make that contact, we can provide that information. But generally, yeah, we want to kind of funnel. That way it helps the staff and case manager kind of keep track of the conversations that are happening. Then moving down to section 5.6.8, Again, we do have townhomes in the central business district as an option, but we failed to get the TBD listed in those dimensional standards. So currently we didn't have anything to really refer to except that we did make those amendments in the old ordinance. And so we just had to kind of pick what was appropriate. In the CMX district seemed to be most aligned with how the TBD zoning district is otherwise set up. So again, we're just adding, again, the TBD in there because townhomes are a permitted use. But if we really looked at it, we wouldn't have any standards to apply. So then we come back to, well, take that back. And again, this was something that was in the old ordinance that was in a fairly late text amendment. And so there were a few of those text amendments that really didn't get captured. So this does return townhouses as a special use permit to the TBD, which used to be the CBD. So then that's why, again, the need to add it here. Pearl Street Townhomes was one of the projects that was permitted under that. And so again, that just makes that cohesive between the use table, the previous amendment under the old ordinance, and going forward. Outdoor storage. At one point in the UDO drafting process, there was a differentiation between outdoor storage that was more than 10 feet above grade and outdoor storage that was below that. I'm not sure, I racked my brain and I couldn't really recall how that differentiation came about, but ultimately it was not carried forward. But we missed in the use table scratching that out. So we have had a couple of outdoor storage uses that had been inquiring, and we're asking the question about, well, what does this 10 feet above grade for outdoor storage entail? Because we just are interested in doing outdoor storage at grade, which outdoor storage not at grade seems a little odd anyhow, but I think maybe it had something to do with it kind of being an sometimes, and so maybe the outdoor storage would take place on some kind of platform. But ultimately, like I say, that wasn't brought forward. It is just a permitted use in the heavy industrial district, so it is very confined, I don't want to say confined, but fairly restricted as to where that use can go. And then warehouse and freight movement. This again was a amendment under the old ordinance to fix this. Warehouse and freight movement had been a special use in the LI or the old I1, but permitted in heavy industrial. Again, that was just one of those things where in heavy industrial, to make something a special use permit in that district when it's really the district you save for all those uses that are the most intense you could have, just didn't make sense. When David was here, he had helped us catch that, and he was like, I think this was supposed to be, light industrial. It could be a special case where you might allow it, but should be permitted in heavy. So again, that's just a consistency thing, again, related to an amendment to the old UDO that just wasn't caught. Sanitary landfill, junk, or salvage yard just has a, needed to have the reference in the notes section corrected to 6.95M. And it may be that we just didn't have that section at all, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just scroll down here. Yes. So it was there, but recycling collection point was not a standalone use. And we're going to come back and talk about accessory uses in just a few minutes. Those are included in another part of the ordinance, but somehow recycling collection points made it into the main list within one part of the ordinance, but it shouldn't have been there. So sanitary landfill, junkyard, salvage yard gets renumbered, and then that causes the change to be made here. And so before I get to those accessory uses, then we want to just talk about a couple of agricultural classifications, and this might be where, Terry, I ask you to chime in a little bit. Bona fide farms versus regular farms, ETJ versus town limits. Just needed to we felt we needed to make some clarifications here, so I'll let you take a crack at it.
So this amendment became a result of where can you have a rooster in the town or in the ETJ? And we had an overlap between bona fide farms, which are regulated under state law, and our regular agricultural uses that might be allowed in the RA. So we've limited the bona fide farms to just the extraterritorial jurisdiction. To be clear, and under state law, basically, if it's a bona fide farm, it is allowed within the ETJ. So it's just clarifying that decision, that distinction between the two, and then also clarifying that while bona fide farms are exempt from zoning, they are subject to floodplain regulation, and they are subject to the building code. So we could have had the option of also exempting them from the building code, but based on some situations that have occurred in the ETJ, we wanted to clarify that the town continues to make them subject to the building code. Now, the two exceptions under state law are greenhouses and therapeutic equine facilities, so we're keeping consistent with state law in that respect.
So they're not allowed in neighborhoods?
So roosters?
Right.
Yeah. So roosters are not allowed in the town limits, clearly,
Okay.
at all.
Because I know of a
I
situation.
don't know that we have any actual farms in town limits that are zoned, rural agricultural, but they would be allowed on a legitimate farm, but not in your neighborhoods. And then the question became, could you be in a neighborhood in the ETJ and have a rooster? And we wanted to clarify that unless you are actually a farm, then you would not be able to have a rooster.
So this is within the town limits, and it is in the neighborhood, because there is a situation, I did get a phone call regarding roosters in a neighborhood, and I'm glad this came up.
Yeah, so go ahead and report that to animal control. I believe that they're still under the, and we are tying together our animal control ordinance, and which has our backyard hen provision. So you can have backyard hens under certain situations, but that prohibits roosters. So we're making it clear by tying the two ordinances together that roosters are not allowed in town limits.
Roosters are a no, but hens are okay.
You can have backyard hens under certain circumstances, and there's some parameters about that. So not every lot would support backyard hens, but we had that within our animal control ordinance, and we're just making sure that both the UDO, that is an accessory use. That's not a way of starting, a bird colony in town limits.
So if animal control is contacted.
Right, for rooster complaints.
For rooster,
yes.
correct. And if animal control doesn't do anything, then what? Because I've had that question also.
Then let me know, or like,
Okay,
let council know, yes.
Okay, I will, thank you.
But there shouldn't be an issue if they're able to observe the roosters.
Okay, thank you. I'm done with that. No more rooster
Thanks, Terry.
Jeff,
Yes.
I have a question. She made me think of something. So how is the UDO enforced?
So the UDO is, if it's purely a UDO zoning related thing, that's enforced by our department, sometimes in cooperation with help and assistance from the inspection staff. So Reggie Bowie is our primary kind of code enforcement person, but anybody in the department can.
I mean, it's like
do
a
that.
letter sent, and then
Yeah,
they're given a
there's-
chance to
yes,
correct
there
it,
are
and then fines or.
Right. So if you go to the section of the UDO that talks about violations, that'll walk you through the process. We generally use a friendly letter first to try to get folks voluntarily into compliance. But if we're not getting anywhere with that, then there is a formal letter sent. And then that's when there's a clock that starts ticking. They have so long to get in touch with us. We have to set up a plan with target dates for them to actually come into compliance. And then if they ultimately don't, then we have to bring in Ms. Jones and the attorney's office because that then has to go above us. There's fines and possible court appearances and things like that.
I remember we talked about it when we were reviewing UDO, but that's kind of a specific situation.
Right. So right above Bonafide Farms, you will see greenhouse, nursery, commercial, outdoor operations, which is basically an agricultural type use. So again, special use permit really doesn't make sense there in that case. Those should just be permitted in the rural agricultural district. So then we come to accessory uses. And if you look in the use table, there is a reference in the use table. And we did that kind of on purpose because we didn't want the use table to get much bigger than it already was. But what we had been finding is that we, as staff, could very easily or more easily than we intended kind of forget about that. And the fact that we have standards for accessory uses, because it's just kind of, otherwise it's kind of just buried in the middle of chapter 6, and it for whatever reason, it just doesn't pop out to us like we would like it to. We always eventually find it, but actually bringing it forward into the use table, we thought would give it a little more prominence, because that is the first place that everybody looks. And a lot of times folks want to know what kinds of accessory uses are allowed, and this actually gives it, I think, a little more succinct presentation to the public. And they all have districts assigned to which they're allowed. So at the end of the day, we just thought, well, let's bring them into the actual use table, format it just like the rest of it, and then make sure that we include a notes field that takes them to all of the additional standards. So whether somebody wants to do a fence in their backyard, which again, permitted in every district, but it also kind of calls attention to the fact that you need some approval for them. Not every jurisdiction requires approval for fences. They may have standards, but they don't have a permitting process like we do. So there again, you see all of the things listed. We also brought in the backyard hens. Backyard hens were previously just kind of tucked away in the town code. We as the planning department had been administering them, even though we usually don't mess with the town code. We just mess with the UDO. So again, as part of just the whole Bonafide Farms, we thought we'll bring those in, make it very formal. And so it's very clear there which districts backyard hens are then permitted. So I think that pretty well covers it. And then again, recycling collection points were moved into that accessory category where they should have been. And again, those are only in non-residential districts. So that's where you have those like clothes collection boxes and things like that. We've always tried to kind of, I think in Garner keep, and in most other communities, honestly, that I've worked in, try to keep some track of what's going on with those so they just don't pop up everywhere.
Jeff, just before you move on from this table, I did notice a few typos, spelling errors
Okay.
under the automatic car washing facility.
Third from the bottom.
From the bottom.
Yes,
And then
thank you.
And then a missing parentheses on the one above it.
Thank you.
But I do like the car washing.
Yeah, as you can imagine, typing in this table can get a little monotonous after a while.
You don't say.
But thank you for calling our attention to those. All right. Yeah, so you can see here actually at the end of the table, it just said accessory, temporary, and home occupation, and then just referred you to the big swath that was section 6.12. So this now will give folks much clearer direction. In section 6.6.4, we inadvertently had the definition for sweepstakes included in two places. We had them for sweepstakes as well as indoor athletic or entertainment facility. So obviously that was not correct. We did have the correct definition in the definitions chapter. So we just had to bring that definition forward and put that in where it was supposed to be. We have had, one recent thing is that we had noticed that this definition doesn't exclude just to amusements, but it clearly does show that those are the typical kinds of things. Under the old ordinance, we had classified, had a history of classifying things like event centers under this category. So we had some discussion actually just today amongst staff as to whether or not we should take a look at this definition or just rely on kind of our past interpretations. So don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that. One thing I will say is we probably do, based on today's discussion, we probably do need to take out theaters out of that definition, because I believe in it's actually expressly ruled a different use. But does anybody have any thoughts on that? Would you read this and think banquet halls or wedding reception halls would be covered by this?
This is a place I go to participate in an activity on the weekend with my family or with friends.
So if you all agree that that would be a good addition to make for clarification, we will go ahead and do that. Does anybody see any potential issues with that interpretation that we've made in the past? There's always uses that people today are doing things that were unthinkable 2 decades ago. And so there's always a provision that we look for, if it's not super expressly stated, that we look for what's closest. And I think we came to the conclusion before that this was the closest thing we had, and it didn't seem to be in conflict with any of the standards for that.
Because they're starting to show up, axe throwing, do you want to add that? I think Raleigh has 3 or 4.
Yep. Yeah, that's clearly one that we've thrown into the amusements category, but it wouldn't, given its popularity these days, it wouldn't hurt to just include it. Objections? Okay. All right. Let's see. We addressed the recycling collection points already. We addressed the clarifications of farming and bona fide farms. Did anybody have any remaining questions on that? Fences and walls. Some of you may recall with the Spring Drive Townhome project, there was a request by the neighbors for the townhome developers to put an 8-foot fence. But that 8-foot fence required the developer to go to the Board of Adjustment to get what ended up being a variance. They used to be called special exceptions under the old ordinance, and it was a much easier process. You still had to go to the Board of Adjustment, but the board didn't have to really weigh too many factors. But when the legislature did their 160D rewrite of how towns and counties do their business, they got rid of the special exception process. And so all special exceptions now have to be treated as variances. And it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to ask somebody to go for a variance just to do a 2-foot taller fence when they're otherwise would be allowed. The only thing that really required them to go to the Board of Adjustment was just to verify that they weren't creating a traffic hazard of some kind, particularly at a corner. And so staff already has, that's already kind of written into the code where you can't block a sight triangle at an intersection. So that's really already being covered. So if there's not really any objections to people being able to have an 8-foot fence, it seems a little bit cumbersome to make them go to the Board of Adjustment just to get permission to do it. So in talking with the Board of Adjustment, we said, hey, let's be very clear that safe vehicular and pedestrian movement, expressly stating that that's inclusive of required sight triangles, that those things are not impeded. And if that's the case, there's really no difference between an 8-foot and a 6-foot fence. And honestly, if you're in a vehicle, 6 feet is just as obstructive as 8. When you're sitting in your car, you're at a height of maybe 3 to 4 feet. So that 6-foot fence is going to block your view just as much as an 8. But hopefully this will not, by doing this, we won't substantially burden the Board of Adjustment with fairly trivial kinds of cases. Because that one it was a little hard to work through because it just was so, you're applying these very heavy standards to something that was very minor. Let's see here. I believe here in the restricted uses in residential districts, again, this is just some formatting changes. Go on down. So this was related to introducing the backyard hen standards. We had to do a little bit of restructuring with the accessory dwelling units, so nothing is changing about the accessory dwelling units section. That it's staying how we adopted it. It's just being reformatted.
I have a question on section B, I guess, part 2. I know we had some discussions on this previously about, who is going to be the occupant of a ADU? Is it going to be a family member? Could it possibly be non-family members and be rented out? Therefore, would they have a requirement to have a separate access to utilities? So should there be a definition there as to who they live in an ADU if it's going to be tied to that dwelling and potentially the same electrical and water and sewer services?
So Any accommodation for that extra public utility meter for the ADU would be the responsible of the property owner. It has to be registered in their name. We can't control who lives in it. There were some things that we had put in that ordinance to start with that ultimately we determined we could not have in there by state law. So a couple of those things about occupancy were removed. But so what you see there is where the town attorney feels we're able to still keep these regulations.
So if, for instance, there was a renter of the ADU and the principal dwelling did not pay their utilities and get shut off, how is that going to be resolved with the ADU renter now saying, my utilities have been shut off because the principal residence has not paid their bill?
I think that just ends up being the same as if you're an adult child still living in the home and your parents' utilities get turned off.
I guess
Yeah,
if it's an ADU and it's a non-family member, there may be an actual rental agreement.
sure.
That's why I'm just wondering how that, if I rent as a non-family member an ADU and the principal dwelling doesn't pay the utilities or moves or something happens, the utilities get shut off. Now you've got a resident that has a rental agreement, let's say, and they have no utilities. How's the town going to address something like that without having separate utility services to that ADU?
So, two things. You may recall last session, there was an ADU bill that would have pretty much allowed accessory dwelling units everywhere. That has not passed. The town council, we prepared a position paper against that, thinking that this is something that we need local control over because there weren't a lot of parameters. As you can see, we have some parameters about the size and things, but the occupancy limits have been, meaning that at least one of the units has to be owner occupied. Those have been struck down by the courts in other jurisdictions. And that clearly was not going to be allowed under the new state law bill. So this basically the recommendation is to get out of the, trying to regulate occupancy of those two units. It's similar to you build a duplex, you could rent both of the duplexes, on that property, and one doesn't have to be owner occupied or, versus the other. And then similar along that line, if they want to have, some jurisdictions to try to control this, we're keeping, 1 meter for both units. But again, that's an area where people were objecting to it. So if they want to have a separate or an extra utility meter so that each unit is separately, we're getting out of the business of regulating that. That's between them and the utility providers. But it's, I guess, no different than a landlord. The utilities are in the landlord's name and the landlord doesn't pay. And, so they would either apply to the county for some kind of housing assistance or dealing with, the utility providers. But most utility providers are making sure that the property owner, is consenting to the setup of the accounts and keeping them in that name. The other thing is we have limited ability now to regulate, to get involved in non-payment. So, if a tenant doesn't pay the utility bill, it's hard to go back under state law to the property owner. It's really whoever has those accounts, the less the town's involved in utilities that we don't provide, directly, probably better. But yeah, it's a problem today. It's not a problem that this regulation can solve. And the fact that the legislature is getting involved in this issue, makes it even more complicated. But we're trying to keep in line with where we see the trend that the legislature might be going in some of these situations.
So section 8.2.6, in dealing with the dedication or fee in lieu of parkland. Again, we do require apartments and other types of dwelling units that are on a single parcel of property to be contributing to that. It's anybody who's bringing new residents to the town who are going to be needing park space to do their recreation. And so the old ordinance, and then we didn't catch this again going forward, kept referring to subdivider. Well, apartments generally aren't subdivided. Sometimes they are, but as a rule, it's one piece of property with multiple buildings. So we wanted to be clear outside of the actual fee schedule that it is the developer, anybody who's developing dwelling units. Originally, we had written developer of residential dwelling units. One of the council members pointed out that that might be a little redundant. Made sense. So just developer of dwelling units. And then to clarify, again, that it's not just tied to a subdivision plan then, but it's whatever, we have that term site-specific vesting plan. So that's any type of plan that's submitted to us that gives the developer the right to keep moving forward once they have it approved. So one of the issues that we had just recently, there was a project that had the master plan approval, which is a type of site-specific vesting plan, but they hadn't yet talked to the Parks and Rec Advisory Committee. Well, that's because there had really been no trigger yet because they weren't proposing an actual subdivision yet. So this will just help bring that process kind of full circle and get the process matched up to how it should operate going forward. On the connectivity index, we noticed that the graphic was counting things incorrectly. For that index to work the way it is supposed to, these black dots at the ends of these stubs should not be there. In essence, it's kind of giving them credit for an actual connection that's not there yet. Instead, those black dots should be here along the highway where you're actually creating a new intersection. So I went to my former place of employment in Knightdale and pulled their graphic because that's where I first was introduced to the concept of these connectivity indexes. They had a graphic that was showing it correctly. So again, you see here at the stub, there is no circle, but at the existing streets where you are connecting, there is a node circle. So that allows you to get the correct calculation for the table that we have that you're supposed to meet. And as a note, a perfect grid network gives you a connectivity index of 2. And there were actually some cases where if you were calculating it the other way, you might get a value above 2, and that shouldn't be possible.
Jeff, I have a question, and just understanding how a cul-de-sac head counts as a connection.
So it does. Yes, it does. So I take that back. This is where I get. The connection is actually the dashed line.
Okay.
That's my bad. So the connection is actually the dashed line. The nodes are just where you either have an intersection or a permanent terminus. And so the idea is you want your connections to actually outnumber slightly the that you get that correct calculation. The fact that there's no dot here gives you that credit for the future connection, even though it's not there yet. So, yeah, I apologize for that. That's where I actually found too that just drawing them in and showing them in as these dashed lines kind of helps bring that to the forefront more than just a different type of circle. So it's nodes and links, and the links are your street stretches. The nodes are your intersection points and your cul-de-sacs. So the fewer cul-de-sacs you have,
Higher your index should be.
the higher your index should be. And also then the more stubs you have, the higher it will be as well. And so there's a table, again, just as a reminder, that there's a minimum threshold you have to get to. It's not set outrageously high. We never had, in my entire time at Nightdale, we never had an issue with anybody meeting it. But it did require a few folks just to think a little more comprehensively about where they were connecting. And then, of course, then we also have our stub completion policy that was endorsed by council, and council asked us to make a reference to that policy so that folks would then know that it's there. So we have proposed this language at the end of the streets section in the UDO, just noting that the council may adopt and amend from time to time a policy that looks at stub connections. Again, that policy does not supersede any requirements of the UDO, so the connectivity index still has to be met. If there's any nonconformities about existing street stubs, those have to be fixed. But if there's anything extra, and that extra connection is raising concerns from neighbors and what have you, then that policy then kicks in and gives council the opportunity to talk, and discuss with everybody whether or not that extra connection is really needed. If it's a positive or a potential detriment. That just incorporates that by reference. Here in the utilities section, this was another formatting error where a section of Article 8 bled over into Article 9. So you'll see here where it struck out, we were still talking about utilities when we should have been talking about building design and parking. Somehow that paragraph got bumped to a next page, and that next page, rather than retaining Article 8, started in Article 9. So this part of the amendment just fixes that, puts all the utility stuff back where it should be.
I have a question on that one. They talk about as-built drawings, and I know the town is going more and more to the system. Should there be a requirement there that they provide a CAD file so that can be incorporated more easily into the GIS model that the town maintains?
Yeah, rather than putting that in the UDO, we do have standards just within our application processes that we get it in certain, if not CAD, in GIS, in shapefile format or whatever. So we do have those standards as a department policy. Yeah. In the parking and loading requirement section, in the previous ordinance, we only talked about VSA, vehicular surface area. But there's really two things that we try to get to, because there are some parking areas, for example, that can be overflow, that can be in grass fields. And those are not impervious, they're pervious. And so the VSA was really targeted at just those impervious areas. Doesn't come into play very often, but it's enough that it comes up that we wanted to distinguish in the new ordinance between vehicular surface area and vehicular accommodation area. So for us now, the vehicular accommodation area is anywhere that cars may be, regardless of pervious or impervious. But VSA is specifically just the impervious areas, which is the majority. And half the time, they're probably one and the same. But we did want to make that distinction in the new ordinance going forward. And so there were just a few things that in translation and bringing some of those requirements forward didn't make sense. One of those is that vehicle accommodation areas may not interfere with parking areas. Parking areas are a vehicle accommodation area. So that was just one easy thing that needed to be struck. A little bit of renumbering. And then regardless of the type of parking, G and H were a little bit redundant, needed to be combined and clarified, just to say that any kind of on-street parking that's, whether it's head-in or angled, and you're bumping up next to a sidewalk, we need to have a little bit of extra room for those vehicles to overhang the sidewalk and not impede on the ADA space. So just being clear that it's any type of parking where there's going to be an overhang, have wider space. Specifically, again, then in vehicular surface areas, during our discussions, as my notes recalled, we looked at the median islands, and particularly the strips that go between rows of parking. In the old ordinance, we required those every 6 rows of parking, and usually you'll have vegetation and maybe even a walkway to let people traverse from one end of the parking lot to the other. And we even looked at the existing Wake Med Hospital here in Garner, their parking lot. They actually have one every aisle, or every 2 double-faced aisle, they actually have one. And I remember we talked about that might be a little bit of overkill. It's nice, for sure, but there was discussion about kind of splitting the difference. Somehow we didn't make that in there, so we have proposed actually making it now every 4 rows of parking, so every 2 aisles, that there's a bigger space. It allows for more vegetation interior to the site and also gives some additional pedestrian access. Screening of industrial properties. Again, this was an oversight when we added buffers into industrial properties. The old ordinance had an exemption that if it was an industrial subdivision, you didn't have to have buffers between the parcels. So again, we're trying to encourage more tree canopy throughout sites. That was something that we decided to reintroduce buffers between individual industrial lots. So we did it in the buffer table, but we forgot to take out the language in the actual ordinance. So this would fix that. Tree canopy preservation, this again was an amendment to the old ordinance, kind of at the end of its life. And this was not picked up, where we introduced a separate tree canopy requirement for the central business district, acknowledging the fact that you have some lots down there that are completely covered by the building that they sit on. That's just kind of the nature of a downtown where buildings share walls. So again, wanted to bring that forward because that was an amendment that we specifically processed and wanted to give to the folks in the TBD to make that district work better. So brought that forward after having missed that. And then here in 12.3.1, we were missing wall signs. There was some language about wall signs here under freestanding, But if you remember, under the old ordinance, we had tables outlining the dimensions and numbers of signs generally. Then we had all these overlay districts, and they had their own sign standards. And so in some cases, I think we had as many as 4 different sign tables that we were looking at, and they were all a little bit different. So as part of the rewrite, we wanted to consolidate that. We kind of said, hey, if it's good for this part of town, it should be good for the whole town. And in that consolidation, we just missed having wall sign standards in commercial areas. So again, we want to make sure that we get that inserted in there. This is currently how we're instructing people to operate, but we need to have that cleared up so that we can actually enforce it. And then define terms, again, vehicular surface area, making that clarification that that is the permanent pavement. And then side yard, we talk about corner side yards in our standards and for setbacks, but we actually didn't have a definition, nor was it really addressed anywhere. So again, just adding a sentence there to the side yard definition to acknowledge that those that are on a corner do have what we call a corner side yard, and that they do have different setback rules. So we summarized the discussion at the town council for you. There were kind of those three issues that came out of that discussion. One was the single family detached in the multifamily district, including the word residential where it really wasn't necessary. And then reference to the street stub completion policy. Otherwise, the rest of the questions were really just clarifying what staff had already put in there. And under the old UDO, again, we had this once before, not too long ago. There's not a lot written about text amendments, but in a few places it does talk about aligning the development code with our desired ends. And so we do as staff believe that anytime we're making these technical corrections and clarifications, that we are asking for your endorsement of these changes to that end, to make things more clarified and better understood by the general public. So we do have that in your analysis and your consistency statement. We kind of did indicate before that for any text amendment that's recommended, this is probably going to be your consistency statement recommendation, because there is not a whole lot that's explicitly said in the old comp plan. So although primarily mentioned in the context of promoting commercial development, the plan discusses the guiding principle of aligning the development code with our desired ends. Whether through consensus or a majority opinion, the successful adoption of a revised regulation may be understood to represent the fulfillment of that principle. And so you have our recommendation there at the end. Council is actually not required to make a reasonableness statement on text amendments. That's only for map amendments. So we do have, though, that motion for you, and that's all I have to present. Hopefully I was able to walk you through that okay.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jeff. Great discussion. I did want to go back to the stub completion policy. I appreciate, incorporating some flexibility into that, because there are instances where maybe that completion doesn't make sense, but I'm also a little nervous about that, just kind of willy-nilly saying, well, that neighbor complained about the street connecting, so we're not going to do it. Is there a way, maybe I'm just thinking too far down, but is there a way to sort of add parameters to that, or put some weight to it that says that this is really a special occasion kind of thing, not a...
So in the policy, we did talk about things like safety issues. So council should identify a reason that's kind of focused on either some kind of safety related thing, whether it's we've talked about lack of sidewalks in existing neighborhoods, and the fact that pedestrians and the vehicles would be using the same space. Trying to think of. We've also talked about where it's fairly obvious that it would create a cut-through opportunity for a large volume of vehicles. So that is talked about in the ordinance, and so, I think staff would be reminding that those kind of things should be explicitly stated as reasons for why.
That's helpful. Any other comments or questions for Mr. Triesenberg? Mr. Jefferson, you've been quiet tonight.
Dave, what in the table?
Aha, I knew there was one.
See, you call me on. You have to make me say something. You was waiting for me to say something. In the residential district development standards, in the table that we have the green square, in the table, nothing goes in that place, right? There's nothing that.
Correct.
Okay, so that
Yeah.
will come out. It'll just be a blank spot. There's not a label. There's not a.
Right. We had originally proposed that maybe we do it permit those as a special use permit in the first draft, but after talking with council, we decided to take that out.
Sure. And then you just. I just want to make sure I clarify that you mentioned that the standards for the setbacks will be based on the setbacks for the existing zoning. So my question was, is it clear that the new zoning setbacks are they the same as the previous setbacks? I guess my question realizes if the setback is different, does it impact, if it was the side yard was 20 total, 10 one side and the other, and then now the new is 15 total and 5 and 10, that impacts how that owner would potentially add on.
Right. So most, if not all, of those 5 subdivisions have their setbacks recorded from their original approval. So anytime that they're recorded at the Register of Deeds, so they're on the plat, we always default to those. Yeah. But in the event that there's not, then we would pull the setbacks from the current.
I would probably assume that most setbacks from the previous UDO actually got smaller. It'd be my presumption over maybe I'm wrong, but.
Actually, there were several that got larger. So the way most of those got approved under that clustering provision, the clustering actually gave them reduced setbacks. So in some cases, for instance, like the front yard in most of those was only 20 feet. Granted, you had to have your garage set back a little bit further, but now it's 25. So,
All right.
yeah, and in some cases too, the sides were also, some of them were as low as 6 feet, and now it would be a combined 615.
I remember that was a big point of contention at that point. That's right.
Just a question on the screen that you have pulled up there. The second bullet point, you talk about lack of compatibility with the present zoning and conforming use and the character of the neighborhood. Can we change those ands to or? Because it's almost like it has to meet all 3 conditions with and in there, whereas if you put or, it could be
Sure.
any one of those.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of an update for that in my planning director's report here in a second.
All right. If there's no more questions, comments, do we have a motion?
I'll make a motion. I move that the Planning Commission accept the consistency statement detailed in Section 5 of this report as their own written recommendation regarding the consistency of the request with the town's adopted land use plans and recommend approval of ZTA 2304 to the town council.
And do we have a second?
Second.
Last chance for discussion.
Is that including the amendments that we discussed with taking theaters out and adding some other verbiage in there?
I'll just say that I appreciate that we made, we gave more clear standards and designations to what our ADUs are and how they can be generated in our residence locations. I think it's important, and so I'm glad that you made it a really important statement here in our UDO that's listed, and more guidelines that it's not so open-ended.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor. I'll call the vote. Gina Avent?
Aye.
John Blasco?
Aye.
Ralph Carson? Philip Jefferson? Jehan Hodges?
Aye.
Sherry Phillips?
Aye.
And Michael Voylan.
All right, thank you very much. And again, thank you to Jeff and your staff for clearly laying those changes out and making those updates. It was pretty follow. All right, moving on. Planning Director report.
So council has had a little bit of a hiatus here over the holidays. So I went back and just checked the December 19th meeting, but there wasn't any final actions on anything at that meeting. So nothing new to report on projects being approved or not. But then I did want to make you aware of that we are, and I've talked with John and Philip about this briefly the other day, on January 30th, that is the council's work session. We have been asked to take a look at the new comprehensive plan, which I think you'll recall comes into effect on February 16th, as to how both council and planning commission can use that document best going forward. So staff is coming to that work session with some ideas for how to use the plan going forward, and would like to propose a joint session. Council does have a few other things to kind of on their agenda that they can address when they start at 6 o'clock. But we'd be willing to have the joint session kick off at 7, which is your normal time here, although it is on a Tuesday. But would like to invite you to a joint work session with the council to talk about how to use the new plan document going forward. If that sounds good to y'all. And I need to talk with John and others about the setup. I know there was a question about could we do a different setup a little bit so it's a little more conducive to discussion. I know in the old building we used to have a big table that we all sat around, and we don't have that here anymore. But maybe we can take a look at some extra tables up here, or using certain seats in the front rows so that it can be a little more of a circular discussion for y'all.
Because the meeting it's a public meeting, correct? So it has to be broadcast on the Facebook, and that can't happen in the training room or audience space in the training room?
I don't know that recording can take place up there. Yeah. Yeah.
It's recording. I would think you could probably just set up a quick Teams meeting and do it that way. I mean, it's a little bit sort of indirect, but the broadcast would be tricky. But even more so tricky is if there's public who wants to attend in person. But I definitely think any way to get us at the same level, so we're not looking down or looking up, would be definitely much more conducive to conversation.
But do most folks think they can make that?
At 6.
The 30th.
The time,
Oh, 7 o'clock.
7.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about not trying to make you try to come earlier.
We do have another board
Appreciate it.
meeting. But I'll be able to be here by
Yeah,
that
I
time.
can make
I have
it.
another board meeting before, but we're usually done by.
That sounds good. We will be sure to send out reminders.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Anything from the commission? Mr. Volan, I know you have a VA hospital update.
No, I don't. You can all see it for yourself. It's gangbusters. Apparently, the Wake County Multi-Jurisdictional Hazard Mitigation meeting is set for Thursday. I'm planning on, through meeting, to come in remotely. Is that the plan?
I believe it is a hybrid option where both are allowed. So at least one of us from staff is going to try to go in person.
Okay.
But then the other one of us will probably be remote as well.
Okay. The second question is, the Duke Clinic still in abeyance in terms of further development there at Benson and Timber?
As far as I know, that is still the case, yes.
Anything else? There have been some questions about the development occurring across the street from the VA clinic. That townhomes, is that my understanding, or is that something different?
Yes, that is a project. I believe the name of it is the Overlook at Stony Creek. That was a project that started out as a special use permit due to the number of units, but as they started working through their site plan, it was clear they were not going to get as many units as they hoped. It actually dropped them under the threshold for a special use permit. The property has been zoned multifamily since it was brought into the town's ETJ back in 1989, I believe it is. So yeah, there is a project that has been approved for that. It originally was going to be a owner-held company that was going to develop them and rent them. They ultimately pulled out and turned it over to Lennar. Lennar is now going to be building it as a build to sell.
Thank you. Anything else? Going once, going twice. Adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good night and stay safe tomorrow with the forecasted severe weather.